Good afternoon. In this week's discussion question, we were asked to consider the following questions. Uh, One, that while some assert that Christian history depends upon defending the historical truth of the Bible stories as well as the historical truth of Jesus Christ, his life, death, and bodily resurrection, that there's nothing more distinctive about Christian history than defending the gospel. Uh, But how does one apply a Christian worldview to the study of history other than what is contained in the Bible? Uh, and the second question was is it important that a historian be a confirmed practicing Christian? Now, I believe that the study of history is important, whether you're a Christian or not. And I'll answer the second question first as to whether or not it is important to be a practicing Christian in order to be able to study history, in which I do not believe that it is. I do believe that looking at history through the eyes of Christianity and the Bible can have a more profound effect upon it and impact, but I don't believe that you necessarily have to be a practicing Christian in order to be able to abstain in order to study historical evidence or historical writings or to be in the occupation of a historian. Um, our other question was, how does one apply a Christian worldview to the study of history other than what is contained in the Bible? Now, as a Christian, most of our uh, views or opinions are probably going to go toward looking at what's in the Bible. However, um, it is important that we continue the study of history so that we as a race can learn and understand our part in it. It is not, however, all about memorizing dates and events, and as a Christian, connecting the study of history in conjunction with the Bible is a way to connect a Christian worldview to it. We can do so by understanding the writings of the Bible and its history in a contextual way, and we can look at the writings of the Bible in a contextual way through exploring other writings and other recordings of history. Let's take, for example, the writings of the flood. Now, we know from biblical history about the flood of Noah, and we know the events that the Bible contains about the flood and how it came to be. But there are several societies and religions that write in reference to a worldwide type flood. The question is where did they get that information? Did that information come from the story of the flood being passed down over generations, or did someone obtain copies of written information that gave them that understanding, or did they look at whatever historical evidence they may have located at the time? Archaeologists and scientists both are still trying to locate the remnants of the ark, and have, and several times and several photographs that I've seen seem to have located something that could be the ark, but without the access to the archaeological site, it's a bit difficult to determine whether or not it is or not. So that's just one example. Um, Now, Dr. Smith says in his video Christian Worldview and History that it's important to understand that the study of history through a Christian worldview is not talking about spiritualization of history, nor are we attempting to connect certain scriptures to historical events. We can go back to the example of the flood, uh, We're not looking at the scriptures that talk about the flood as to the historical evidence of when that event happened, because it doesn't really give us a date and a time through biblical writings as to when that happened. But we can look at other writings of other societies and religions of when those writings were done, and perhaps even if dates or times or specific other historical events are mentioned, or particular locations and cities are mentioned, that we can look at archaeological evidence or look at written evidence that can kind of give us a roundabout view or a roundabout ideal of when that event may have occurred in human history. Even though it may be from another religion or another society that may have written it, we can use it to kind of center down on when the possibility of that event happened. Um, so Dr. Smith also makes this statement that we can't look at history in necessarily a providential way. Now, we as Christians tend to do so because we tend to look at history in the same way that Darrell Hart makes a statement, and this is a paraphrased manner of saying it, that history shows God is in control of the events of history. Another person that made a statement similar was the English Presbyterian clergyman John Flavel, who was born in 1627, and made this statement, that the providence of God is like a Hebrew word. It can only be read backwards. We do tend to look at history backwards, of course, and you also look at the providence of God involved in those historical events backwards, because you're looking at what God did in those events, just like you do in your own life. You may look back 10 or 15 or 20 years, um, and you could see certain instances and certain situations where God may have had his hand of providence in it. Um, and one of the main ways that we study history in general, as I said, are within the writings of recorded history. History has had a great deal of writers that recorded specific writings in history. Herodotus is probably one of the most well-known writers of history um, that we have. Uh, we can study the Bible through the lens of history, and that can give us a glimpse, even though we're looking at Scripture, it can give us a glimpse into the history and culture, views, and the religion of the Hebrew people, because the Old Testament is indeed a written and recorded history of the Hebrew people. Um, Now, I realize that me looking at um, the Bible and looking at it as a historical document, or looking at history through a Christian worldview, kind of sways my um, opinion a little bit. Um, and it may sway it in a little more of a Christian type bias than it may others, but I have found that looking at many of the writings throughout the Bible in an historical fashion helps me to conceive a better understanding of what is actually written. Let me take, for example, Paul's writings. Now, over the last couple of years, I've been attempting to be a writer. It's going a little slow. I've written one small book, and I'm in the process of writing two or three others that I'm currently working on. I tend to write um, in a more instructional uh, view on particular biblical subjects. than I do on anything. But in my writings, I'll sometimes use not only the Bible to study for my own personal studies, but for studies in order to write my books and do my writings. And I'll study the Bible in a contextual way, but I'll also look at other historical writings and other historical information that I can obtain to kind of give me a better understanding of what Paul and other writers may have been referring to as certain illustrations or as certain events. And like I said, we'll take Paul's writings for example. And now I just got finished with a Roman civilization class a couple of months back through the university, and in it I learned about Paul's time in Corinth, and scholars have put Paul in Corinth around 50 AD, with him being there for about a year to 18 months. They state that during that time he most likely worked to sustain himself in his known trade of tent making and fabric work, which would have been pretty good considering that Corinth was a main thorough through, and it had a harbor, so there were probably a lot of ships that came through and sailors that would have been looking for tents and fabric work and maybe even repairing of sails and things of that effect. According to scholars, that's where he would have also made connections with Priscilla and Aquila, who were in the same trade as he was and may have worked together while there in Corinth. Um, Scholars also say that he may have made other connections in the region of Athens and Thessalonica and all some of those regions with people like Theophilus and possibly even Epaphroditus, who he mentions in later writings. He also talks about how we as Christians are running a race, and if we don't give up, we receive a crown in the end. Now, this is one of the things that I'm talking about of looking at other historical writings and historical evidence in a contextual way, because we don't really get a clear understanding of why Paul is making this reference in his writings. But if you'll read in the early history of the region, you'll learn that Corinth hosted what was known as the Isthmus Games. And these games were athletic events like races and other athletic events, and the winners of those races would receive a crown made, or a wreath made of branches, like olive branches or something. And Paul describes those as being temporal, unlike the crown Christians would receive. Uh, Now, I wouldn't have understood that reference without the knowledge of history that I've obtained through looking at not only Paul's writings in Corinthians, but also other historical writings, recordings, and historical evidence that we have. We know for certain through historical writings and archaeological evidence that Corinth did indeed host these Isthmus games. It was known throughout the Roman world that these games took place. Um, like I said, I wouldn't understand that reference without my knowledge of those historical events and looking at those writings in not only a contextual but a Christian worldview way. So, in closing, I believe that history is not just memorizing a bunch of dates or events or people involved in those events, or how those people being involved in those events may have created a causal effect in other historical events. But it's also a way that we as Christians with a Christian worldview can explore the evidence of history through writings and archaeological studies and historical evidence, and do so within the context of the times in which those people who did those writings and the Bible lived.